Joining us now, NBC News Capitol Hill correspondent Ali Vitale, former U.S. Attorney and law professor Barbara McQuade, and Donell Harvin, former D.C. Chief of Homeland Security and Intelligence, who warned of potential violence ahead of January 6th. So, Ali, first to you, Speaker Pelosi, saying just in the last hour the House is now hoping the Senate will finish up so the House can pass the final version of the government funding bill, the omnibus bill, tonight, before they get home, if they can then get home because of the flights, at least to the West. Is that correct?
Yeah, Andrea, that's exactly right. We just finished with House Speaker Nancy Pelosi in her last news conference with reporters before she departs leadership. And it's a busy time for her here, closing out her speakership tenure, talking about how the House will have to pick up once the Senate finishes its work on this omnibus package. The House expected potentially to stay tonight, late, or pick this up in the morning. Both are options that the Speaker left on the table because, look, the Senate has several hours more of work ahead of them. They came together on a deal on this larger funding package this morning. Last night, it looked like things might fall apart. But now, of course, they are on track over the course of the next few hours to work through a few amendments that were voted on. And then, of course, to pass this larger package, a really busy time to the end of the year. But look, you're right. This storm was always a factor here. And one senator pretty much stating the obvious to our team this morning, saying, well, we've now waited so long. Flights might be hard to come by. We probably should have done this earlier, which seems to be the sentiment here. Yeah.
And Ali, let's just also set the stage on the transcripts. You've had a chance, briefly at least, to look through them. I've been looking through them as well. Let's talk about the highlights that you're seeing.
Yeah, Andrea, I think a lot of us are multitasking as we got this transcript during Speaker Pelosi's news conference. I've been able to read through pieces of it because this is one of the key transcripts that we've been looking for. 2 days of Cassidy Hutchinson's depositions. This is after she changed attorneys, but that attorney shift is really important because we had been wondering if these transcripts and the report would answer the question that the committee seemed to have publicly posed about whether or not anybody in Trump's inner orbit was representing a certain witness, who we now know is Cassidy Hutchinson, with the goal of having her mislead the committee. And we see now at various points in her testimony after switching her counsel that it seems that one of the top White House ethics lawyers, Stephen Passatino, when he was representing her, was doing a lot to try to advise her to say that she was, in her words, just a secretary or a lower level staffer. There was something that I read where at one point she says to the committee, I want to make clear to you, Passatino never told me to lie. He specifically told me, this is Hutchinson telling the committee, I don't want you to perjure yourself, but I don't recall isn't perjury. They don't know what you can and can't recall. It's really important, Andrea, because we've heard this, too, that people like Tony Ornato, one of the key people at the center of what happened in the presidential vehicle on January 6th, he supposedly told the committee often that he couldn't recall. Hutchinson there getting that advice, but of course we know that she was ultimately the one to put that story in the public view during that special hearing.
And Barbara McQuade, I'm not a lawyer, but I know that saying I don't recall when you do recall, that's perjury.
Absolutely. You know, the reason I don't recall can be problematic for prosecutors is it can be difficult to know what someone did and did not recall. And if they say they did not recall, then in some instances, you just sort of have to live with that answer if you can't otherwise prove it. But that does not give you license to say I don't recall when, in fact, you do recall. And that's what was going on here. So Passatino says he's kind of talking out of both sides of his mouth when he says, I'm not asking you to perjure yourself. I'm just saying if you say you don't recall, they don't know what you do and don't recall. He actually is saying you can lie and get away with it because they won't be able to prove what you do and don't know. And that is not what witnesses are compelled to do. They are compelled to come in and answer questions truthfully. So lying about what you do and do not recall is perjury.
Now, let me just read from the transcript because she says he told her, quote, if you don't 100% recall something, even if you don't recall a date or somebody who may or may not have been in the room, that's an entirely fine answer. And we want you to use that response as much as you deem necessary. Cassidy, according to the transcript, then asks, but if I do recall something, but not every little detail stuff, and can I still say I don't recall? And he responds, yes. Let me read something else that's just been flagged to me, and I have got the transcript in front of me. At another point, Barbara and Ali, he says, well, Mark, meaning Mark Meadows, wants you to let you know that he knows you're loyal And he knows you'll do the right thing tomorrow and that you're going to protect him and the boss, Trump. You know, he knows that we're all on the same team and we're all a family. Do well. Let me know how it goes. So that's her lawyer, provided by the White House, telling her, Mark, the chief of staff, her immediate boss, and the boss, the president of the United States, want you to know we're all on the same team and we're a family. Barbara, that's right out of The Godfather, you know, telling the witness before the, Senate committee, you know what to do.
Yes, absolutely. And I think it is very potentially a basis for a witness tampering violation. Now, you have to show that the person had a corrupt intent. That is, that they intended to coach the person to lie. And sometimes they can get around that by saying, vaguely, oh, and we knew that the team just wanted to tell the truth, and that's what we were all about. So a jury would have to believe that that's what was going on here, that she was being coached to lie and even intimidated to lie because that's what her bosses wanted her to do. But I think that a jury could reasonably find that based on these facts, and perhaps there are others that could corroborate that. Perhaps there are other witnesses who got the same kind of coaching who would be willing to testify to that fact.
And we know that Ali Vitale, that Cassie Hutchinson, of course, was Meadows' top aide. She was right in his outer office. She knew everything, was reporting on his phone calls right down the hall from the Oval Office. Also, Cassie Hutchinson indicating that the chief of staff, Mark Meadows, knew the president had lost the election back on December 19th. That she says she went to the National Archives with Meadows to essentially begin the process of setting up a presidential library. This is after the electoral count had been done by the Electoral College in December, well before January 6th. Tell us what happened there, Allie.
Yeah, Andrea, that's important, too, because it again speaks to the mindset of the former president, which the committee has gone through painstaking detail trying to establish who was telling him what, specifically that members of his campaign, White House, unofficial inner circle outside of the White House, all of them were telling him in various ways, you lost the election, and that he was still going forward, trying to find ways to overturn it, eventually resulting in what happened here on January 6th. So that's just another piece of the puzzle there. And just to double back, when you see people like Ben Williamson, who's another top and longtime aide to Mark Meadows, telling Cassidy Hutchinson, he knows that you're loyal, he knows that your deposition is today, that is something that the committee had sort of forecasted over the course of several public hearings, that this kind of witness tampering potentially and other pressures were being applied to, at that point they were just saying witnesses, but we suspected and now we know that it was Cassidy Hutchinson. All of that does speak to the way that things work within Trump world. And I think the other thing that's important here to remember too, Andrea, and we talked about this over the summer, is the fact that this committee has said we should read the transcripts closely, and that in certain cases, people like Kayleigh McEnany, who were higher in stature and title, they recalled less things seemingly than their lower level deputies. And those lower level people were privy to a lot of information. This was always true during the Trump campaign in 2015 and 2016, certainly true in the White House. It wasn't your typical hierarchical org chart. And so the fact that they have cooperation from all of these lower level people is really important, and it also sort of offsets the idea that Cassidy Hutchinson was just a secretary because she was privy to just so much, and that's really the way that Trump world has always worked.
Yeah, and it's fascinating, Ali Vitale and Barbara, that in fact he was talking, Mark Meadows was going to a meeting about the presidential library, the post-presidential library, which is something you do after the president has conceded or lost or is term limited. It's after the presidency. So Mark Meadows knew that they had lost. I wanted to get to Janelle because the most critical question here remaining is why wasn't the National Guard deployed earlier in the day? Why were the warnings about potential violence not given? There had been suspicions that the Pentagon was somehow complicit because the Secretary of the Army had to deploy the National Guard if the president did not, because the District of Columbia is not a state and doesn't have the same powers. The mayor doesn't have the powers that a governor has. But this seems to indicate something quite different in terms of taking the Pentagon or the acting defense secretary off the hook. Janelle?
Well, I'll make it clear. That is the key question. There's a big difference between planning a heist and getting away with it, right? So the committee's done an excellent job of articulating the planning leading up into the heist. And what we don't know is how were they able to get away with it. We weren't surprised on January 6th of the activities that were unfolding. We were shocked that they were actually able to penetrate the Capitol. I'll read directly from the report. My memory is not getting as good as it used to be. The intelligence and law enforcement agencies did successfully detect the planning for potential violence on January 6th, and the information was shared readily throughout the executive branch. That includes the National Security Council and the U.S. Secret Service. The larger question is, and reading through the summary, Chief Sund, who was the then Chief of Capitol Police, was mentioned twice in 156 pages. The Sergeant at Arms and the House Sergeant at Arms on the Senate and the House side, they weren't mentioned at all. And so there's a glaring omission there that hopefully the full report will get to. But there's a big gap in the information about why the National Guard wasn't called out and who's responsible for doing so.
And so, Donell, can you interpret, I know this is asking a lot, what you know of the bureaucracy, and you were one of those warning, and you were interviewed by the committee. Can you interpret just why we saw the video of Pelosi, Schumer pleading with the White House, pleading, calling the governor in Richmond, calling the governor in Annapolis. They were ready. They came by. But what we later also learned from Senate hearings that were held, last spring, Klobuchar and Senator Blunt, is that the head of the National Guard, who's now, I think, the police chief of the Capitol Police, he was just told to stand by. He had them ready to get on a bus.
Yeah, so you're absolutely right. And actually, I was on the call that Chief Sund made requesting active National Guards to respond. What people need to understand is that the National Guard historically is not a police force. They're not a rapid response force. When they're inserted, they need to have rules of engagement. And so by the time that those calls were made as the Capitol is being sieged, it was a little too late. The preparation to have National Guard on standby should have happened before. So those men and women can be properly trained and equipped in a disorder control posture to repel those attackers. And so dropping them in an active seizure of the Capitol is going to be difficult at best. Once again, the question begs, why were they not pre-positioned? There's a lot of finger-pointing that was going on behind the scenes and in open testimony between Chief Sund and the respective Sergeant of Arms, and hopefully the full report will get to why that wasn't happening.
And, of course, the Republicans have their minority report trying to blame Nancy Pelosi for that and everything else. But it seems to me that she's not in the chain of command. And she is literally in the chain of command as the Speaker. But in terms of law enforcement, it was outside her purview. Well, I mean, what you just raised is so critically important. I think Donell just bottom-lined it, Barbara. I'm going to ask you to stand by as we proceed today because so much is breaking around us.